I just want to say hello and welcome to everyone, especially our special guests from Dix Hills. It's always nice to meet people from different congregations as we discuss various things. We are very excited. Tonight we have our speaker, Bruce Spierer. Is that the right way to say your name? Yes, okay. Who is the public education manager at Hazon. And he has done a lot of very interesting things related to agriculture and helping people learn about the importance of that. He's worked in urban agriculture, community composting, and public horticulture. He's also worked in nonprofit strategic planning and leadership development, and he holds a master's degree from New York University in environmental conservative education, focusing on nonprofit management. He's an amateur naturalist and a lover of composting and an avid fermenter of food and drink. So I'm sure there are a lot of good stories and interesting experiences there. Does anybody have any questions before we begin? Okay, so we're going to begin and we'll ask, I think everyone is already muted. And if you, Bruce, are you going to want to take questions at the end, or are you okay with people asking questions as you go?
I think I'll try to note the point where it's probably good for questions. There's gonna be a little bit of science in here, so it's good to have the flow of science.
Okay.
And then we're gonna get to our halakhic portion, our Jewish law portion, and that's a great time for conversation. But I'm gonna try to leave space for open conversation. But also people throw things in the chat that feel pertinent. I probably won't see it, but like Shoshana or Rachel, just feel free to let me know. I like to kind of have a looser space.
Great. Well, with that, you may start. We're all eagerly awaiting.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm super excited to be here. I am a relatively new member of Becky. And I would have loved to do this in person, to be honest, but because of the content, it actually works better virtually. I'll also say that you will see that the presentation is on Hazon stationery, etc., and all that. I am not here as a Hazon employee. This is a slideshow I originally developed for work, but I just want to, like, I'm here as a Becky community member, really just sharing something I'm deeply passionate about. So what I will do is share the screen, and feel free, there's ways to adjust the settings where you could just see part of my face or see the whole gallery. Whatever has you feel more engaged, go for it. And then, like I said, we'll go through a conversation after that. So there. Great. So everyone can see my screen? Perfect. So this is a conversation that's near and dear to my heart, both a conversation about Shmita and a conversation about soil, both of which are relatively underrepresented in their respective fields. Many people, when, like in the Jewish world, when they hear Shmita, either doesn't know what it is, or maybe like heard it in like one line from a Torah that comes up like once or twice a year. And same thing in the world of agriculture and gardening. The soil is a very underrepresented field. So just a quick bit about me, and Shoshana gave that most of that already. I have a background in environmental education. I worked as an urban farmer and horticulturist for 9 years in New York City. And what particularly relevant for what we're talking about today, I really did a lot of compost education and operating compost systems. So I work out of Battery Park City Parks, which is on the southwest corner of Manhattan. And they were one of the earliest fully sustainable park institutions, and they made a lot of their own compost in the ground level of a building. So there were people living above it. So a lot of times compost has this negative connotation, like, oh my God, it smells, yada, yada, yada. I would say that's just bad composting, because we did it right in the middle of New York City. And I won't say bad. There's ways of doing it where we could do it right in the heart of New York City. So I used to manage about 3,500 pounds of food waste a month, turning it into compost. I'm now recently became the program manager at Hazon. It's a slightly different focus. And this past year, I focused a lot on Shmita education. I actually have books that we published, one of my co-authors that I want to donate to the Becky Library that I keep on forgetting to take out of my car. But I will be donating a copy of Rav Kook's Shabbat Haaretz, and we created a Shmita source book, which is near and dear to my heart. I had a lot that went into there. And I do a lot of work on institutional greening, and just a big shout out to the Becky Green team. So a little bit that I want to cover. We did the introduction. I want to look at.
Can you, right now, our ability to see the slide is obscured by your
Oh
control panel.
no. I was afraid that. Let me try something. I was afraid that was the case. Um, is that better?
Yes, it is, Bruce.
Yeah,
I'm
'cause-
seeing a black bar above the where
yeah,
the
that's
heading
the
of the
that's the
slide
screen
is.
share bar. And it's like become a recent issue, but I'll put it on the bottom.
Yeah, can you slide it up or down? Oh
Yeah.
no, now the problem's back. Now the blocking window
Okay,
is
those are
back.
my notes. So I'm just gonna go
Oh
without
yeah, okay.
notes, and that's okay because I've done this enough times. Um, so a couple things I want to cover is what happens to the land during Shabbat Haaretz or letting the land rest, and we'll unpack that a little bit because it's not explicitly a Torah session. We won't go too much into the texts, but essentially it's a year where we are commanded not to plant the land, not to harvest from it, not to plant it. And what happens to the land when we stop planting it? And then we'll look at how does modern Israel approach this command of Shabbat Haaretz. And we're looking at Israel because the command to let the land lie fallow actually only uh, requires the boundaries of biblical Israel. So it doesn't actually legally apply to us. And then, like, do these modern approaches to Shmita improve the health of the land? So the command for Shabbat Haaretz appears in two places, one in Exodus, one here in Leviticus. But this specific pasuk, this verse, is really where we pull out a lot of the Jewish law of what we do and don't do. Can someone maybe just unmute and just read this verse for me? And I can't
In
see
the
the
seventh
words.
year. Oh,
Go ahead.
but in the seventh year, the black box appeared.
Okay, go ahead.
But in the seventh year, the land shall have a Sabbath of complete rest, a Sabbath of the Lord. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard. You shall not reap the aftergrowth of your harvest or gather the grapes of your untrimmed vines. It shall be a year of complete rest for the land.
So, thank you. So there's, I imagine a few questions would come up, like, what is a Sabbath of complete rest? What does it mean for the land to have a Sabbath? Is it like a regular Sabbath? Um, why are you asking me to not sow the field or prune the vineyard? Uh, in our modern context, the ramifications might not be immediately present, but in a society where we're agrarian and we're growing our food that's right in front of us, and it's most of our livelihood, it's pretty apparent. The question of like, oh my God, what will we eat? Another fun question I love to ask is, what is the aftergrowth of my harvest? And then again, we end with this, it's a complete rest for the land. So, one sec. There we go. Uh, So I'm just give a broad overview of what is the law that's pulled out of this. There's a thick book that's sitting in a box. It was on my bookshelf, but I'm moving, so it's in a box that really goes into the complexity of the laws around Shabbat, around Shemitah. But I would say it breaks down to these four areas. So one is a prohibition on planting. We don't cause new plants to grow. So we don't put seeds in the ground, or we don't start plants in the greenhouse and then take those plant starts and put them in the ground, called transplanting. And we don't cause an existing plant to grow productively, to prune. So if I was growing grapes, I actually prune back old growth because grapes grow on new growth. The other side of it is prohibition on harvesting. So there's rules governing the harvest of annual crops, which again can be fairly complex of when was the crop planted, or is it a volunteer, maybe the seed fell behind, and then also the governing of perennial crops. And perennial crops here means uh, crops that I didn't plant that year, but maybe grows on trees or bushes like grapes, olives, figs. Specific to the land of Israel, here we might think of apples, peaches, stone fruits, those kinds of things. And we can harvest them, but in specific ways. But again, that's a very technical conversation. So these are three questions I think about, right? What's the purpose of Shabbat Haaretz? Why does the land need to rest? And what happens to the land when the laws of Shabbat Haaretz are observed? Now I'm going to say those first two questions we're not going to touch today. If you came here just to talk about these kinds of things, you are going to leave disappointed. These are really questions of like Torah, a question that we might have in a real textual conversation, and it's not really entirely clear. Right? There's different opinions on what's the purpose of letting the land rest, why, at least from a Jewish perspective, we do it. But what I do want to look at is what happens when we actually let it rest, which is a really nerdy, fun, exciting scientific conversation that I think you all will be excited about also. So before we actually look at what happens when we let the land rest, we have to think about what happens to the land when we're working it. So on the left, actually I'll go back, right? So I'll say that farming could be broken down into some very basic areas, right? One part of it is preparing the bed for planting, tilling, plowing, shaping the soil, especially in a modern context, fertilizing, chemical fertilizers have taken over the agricultural market, for better or for worse, in my opinion, for worse. And then actually putting the plants out, sowing the seeds, transplanting the starts. So here on the left is an image of Egyptians sowing the land, how they farm it. And what we see is animals pulling behind them some kind of a plow that's going to cut rivets into the ground that we can plant. And on the right, we have a modern beast that is cutting rivets into the ground for us to plant. And not a lot has changed since the dawn of the agricultural revolution. In a lot of ways, farming is the way we do it today is very similar, right? We till the soil to put plants into it. This is the conventional approach. But what I want to look at specifically is what happens when we till the land. We often say like, oh, we need to till it so we get plants in there. And this is, maybe some of you own a rototiller that tills up soil in a backyard. It's a smaller version of what farms use to till the soil. And I want you to like really there's a close-up look there. What's happening to the soil? I mean, it's really kind of taking chunks and really blending it up, right? It's a completely different substance. I would call it almost violent, right? More like a blender, right? We have like these beautiful plowed fields. But I would say that if I were maybe an organism living in the soil, maybe someone's coming to destroy my home. Maybe I'm being killed, which actually has its issues. And that's what we're going to look at, right? So what I'm super excited about is the whole world that lives beneath this soil. And that's ultimately going to answer our question of why do we let the land rest? So I love this image because it takes what we might see, right? When we walk through, let's say, West Rock Park or even Edgewood, we would see trees, maybe some smaller shrubs, some lower growing plants. What we don't see is everything that's happening under the ground. And we're going to break some of these out. And if this were a gardening class, I would spend like a full hour outside, like just talking about these. But we see fungi, it's breaking out some of the smaller insects. Then we have all these other microorganisms. There's literally billions of bacteria in there, and they're all living inside the soil. So this idea that the soil is this dead clod of earth is actually not accurate at all. It's actually, like by density, one of the most alive places in creation, in existence. So to look at it, so the home, the soil itself is about 45% sand, silt, clay, just the actual what we hold in our hands, the gritty stuff, the eroded rock over time. That forms pockets, which there might be air or water, and that's actually, in many cases, about 25-25, so half of that space is air and water. And then there's this sliver soil organic matter, 5%, which is everything that's living in there. And then if we break it out, it breaks out more dead organisms, things that are maybe breaking down. 5% of that 5% is what's actually living there. And then 50 to 80%, depending on the health of the soil, I'll say probably most of America's lands are below that 50%, is humus, this stable organic matter, which actually, when we see like the dark soil, it's that humus that's giving it that color that often signifies fertility. And there are literally billions of organisms living in that 5% of the 5% of the soil. So just this diagram kind of depicts what it might look like, because it's really hard to conceptualize, like what would it mean to actually live inside the soil. So all of these bits of rock that we see like they don't fit together. I like to imagine different sized balls inside of a container. They don't all fit together perfectly, but there's all these little spaces in between. So there might be air and water, but what this is showing, on the left we have this plant root hair that's growing, right, really taking up a lot of space, and then there's bacteria that's living around it, and then maybe a fungus is growing through all the pieces of rock to connect with bacteria. And then we see all kinds of organisms. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but there's the amoeba in the center, and everything's kind of living there. So who does live there? The FBI. This is one of my favorite little bits. I used to teach kids this a lot, and they would get really excited when we tell them the FBI was living where they were. The FBI stands for fungus, bacteria, and invertebrates. So there are more living. So in a teaspoon of healthy soil, I could also say healthy compost, there are more living organisms in that teaspoon than people on the earth. So that means literally billions and billions, which is really hard to conceptualize. And this video on the bottom left is actually a microscope slide of some soil that actually shows you that's the life that's in there. That's usually at about 400 times magnification. So within there, we have fungal hyphae. So on the right, I have this image of a plant root, and all those white strands are not the plant. It's actually the fungus, the living part of the mushrooms that are connecting with the plant, reaching out through the soil. Each of those are single organisms that kind of like to make buddies with other organisms, other fungus. They like hold hands in a chain, and they form these huge networks. So each individual organism is 2 to 15 micrometers long, but they can literally take up miles of space. The largest organism in the world is several square miles big in Oregon, and it's a mushroom that lives underground. Then we have the larger organisms. So you can kind of see the dots zipping around. Those are flagellates. They have these little tails that whip around that shoot them through, and they're eating different fungi and bacteria. Earlier, you would have seen bigger blobs, and there's this kind of blob on top, which might be a ciliate. If the microscope moves up there, great. And then yes, that's a ciliate or maybe an amoeba. It's hard to tell. And then there's nematodes, which we often have a bad association with. I think they get a bad rap. And then the arthropods, the things that we actually see. And there we go. So when we think about the soil, it's an ecosystem, right? When we learned in school, you go to we love talking about the African savannah where like lions are eating gazelles and the gazelles are eating the plants, and it's this happy place. But this actually is happening all over the planet, including under the soil. So I guess also just for the videos, on the bottom are nematodes. So these are microscopic worms that are living in the soil. And just like we might say in the savannah, the soil functions the same way. So there are producers. So like plants are the origin of many ecosystems where they take energy from the sun and they store in their bodies, and then other things eat the plants. Similarly, that happens in the soil. And then other organisms eat what the plants give off. So what's actually happening on the bottom left is these are fungus that have captured the nematodes in these rings, and they're sucking the life out of nematodes. Elsewhere, we saw ciliates eating bacteria. It's a very complex food web of predators and prey, and it's self-balancing. I like to say that no one goes into a forest to fertilize it. So when we talk about like fertilizing our lawns and taking really close care and paying attention, like what's happening there and why? So to briefly go through what this ecosystem might look like. So it starts with the leaves, or the solar panels, nature's solar panels, and here the little blowout box is the stomata. They're these little openings that take in gases, particularly carbon dioxide. It's sent through the plant veins into the roots, converted into sugars, and whatever the tree doesn't want or the plant pushes it out through its roots, it's called exudates. They're sugars, minerals, whatever, waste, and that's the food of the soil. Billions of organisms will bacteria will crowd around a root to try to get that nutrients, and then other organisms will come eat those organisms, And that's actually how an entire forest is given its nutrients. We don't see all of this happening, but it's like a little marketplace happening. A fungus will wrap around the tree root and maybe take some sugars, and then it'll grab carbon from another area or phosphorus from another area and then transport it to a tree in exchange, right? There's this crazy marketplace happening. And like I said, it becomes this fairly complex food system. And I kind of laid it out, but what's amazing, and I really want to underscore that the parts that we only end up seeing and focus on are maybe like the birds and the animals, right? The visual beings often get the most love from humans, but there's a whole other world that we don't see. So why should we care about all of this science? So it does a lot of things. When we have a healthy soil ecosystem, it's actually making the soil healthier, right? The only way we actually build healthy soil is carbon dioxide is pulled from the atmosphere, transported through a tree or another plant, and the organisms take that and process it, and it eventually becomes stable organic carbon. It becomes compost. And that's actually what's increasing fertility over time. And like I said, it's pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. If anyone's heard about this thing called the climate crisis and global warming, right, this is pretty relevant to that, right? The soil is a major storehouse of carbon, and poor agricultural practices of constantly tilling the soil has actually released a lot of the carbon into the atmosphere. But good farming and good land management practices actually has the ability to pull carbon out and put it back in the soil, actually helping us address the climate crisis. I put cycle nitrogen here. The only thing we have to know about nitrogen is that's what we're fertilizing. It does not stay in the soil well. But what happens is the bacteria end up holding nitrogen in their bodies. Then something might eat the bacteria, and when they poop, they release the nitrogen that the bacteria is holding. Then another organism might eat that organism. And what's happening is the nitrogen lives there in the soil because the organisms have it in their bodies, and when the plants need it, it's right there for them. I'll skip down to the wood wide web. I did mention the fungus. They literally produce a whole network throughout the soil that links plants together. And it almost becomes like a kind of communication. One of my favorite stories in this book, it is totally eluding me right now. The Hidden Life of Trees actually talks about him finding a beech tree trunk that was cut, but it was clearly alive. He was able to see green under the bark layer. And what he found was that the tree roots were linked together, and the trees were actually feeding nutrients to that tree stump, keeping it alive, just because that's the way they naturally function. And similarly, fungi extend those networks even further and will link plants that are not connected. So it almost feels like when people talk about like the Gaia theory, this idea that the whole Earth is this living system, it starts to feel kind of similar to that when we talk about it. And I just can't see my. Oh, and then this idea that I showed you that image of a fungus eating a nematode. Again, people that are plant people, often nematodes are this pest that we have to battle. In a well-balanced ecosystem, that's not an issue because there's competition, diversity. There are plenty of other organisms to outcompete the bad guys. Oftentimes, the bad guys are just opportunists that are coming to an unhealthy system that are taking over. So a lot of these issues with pests and disease get severely mitigated, if not eliminated, in ways that it wouldn't be. So let's say more tomatoes that aren't suffering from soil blight. So, then what happens when I start tilling the soil, doing this thing that we've done for 12,000 years? Well, it's like taking all of our friends in the FBI and putting them in this blender. So it's destroying this wood wide web, this connective tissue under the soil, because fungi aren't very resilient to blades chopping them. It's killing the soil microbes, reducing the biodiversity, so there's more pests now. It has less ability to hold the nutrients that we need for the plants to grow. So now all of a sudden we need to apply chemical fertilizers. It releases all that stored carbon into the atmosphere. It breaks up soil structure. Let me go back, which I will look at in a second. Decreases air and water, so it's actually harder to penetrate the soil and get what we need in there. And I love this image because on the left, it just seems so clear how the soil on the left just doesn't look healthy, and the soil on the right looks like it's going to hold something. Looks like if I was trying to put a shovel into the soil on the left, like I might hurt my shoulders. Where on the right, it looks great. Because when we actually have things live in the soil, it holds the soil together in ways where air and water can flow through. It doesn't compact like that. But over time, it becomes what's happening on the left. And this is essentially what caused the Dust Bowl in the 30s. This is what's happening in a lot of the Midwest. We are losing soil to the Mississippi River because the topsoil is being washed away over years. But this doesn't have to be the future, right? There are ways to farm and do this that's healthy. So this is our halakhic portion, and this is where I invite people to interrupt because I think we have about like 30 minutes. And also, actually, maybe I'll pause here for a sec because I said a lot about like the sciencey stuff. So I just want to pause, just thoughts, questions. I also couldn't see you because I was looking at my shared screen, so it felt weird. I felt like I was talking to a void. Yeah.
What I have a question.
Yeah.
I hear a lot about how different different crops like grow well together. Like I hear about this sort of milpas thing where corn and beans, I guess what I always hear is that corn depletes the nitrogen in the soil and beans sort of add it back in. I'm not sure exactly what that means. And squash, I guess, is involved in that too, sort of as the third sister or whatever. But are there other things like that? Are there other sort of food combinations or sort of growth combinations that like work well for the soil in different places, or that this sort of our sort of factory style of farming has diminished the awareness of?
Yeah.
I don't know.
That's a great question. I'm going to take the liberty to take that in two directions. And the first is the three sisters that you mentioned, right, as an example of indigenous wisdom. And I would say indigenous peoples, right, to North America, which I won't get to that right now, had a much deeper knowledge and respect for the land and just an understanding. So these systems that actually are meant to complement each other were developed over time in deep relationship with the land. So the three sisters are really interesting because you have beans, which are a legume which naturally fixes nitrogen from the atmosphere, right? So nitrogen, this elusive element that we're trying to always harness, it naturally does that. And it provides nitrogen for corn, which is super nitrogen intensive, which is one of the reasons why we're bombing our soils with nitrogen or fertilizers in the Midwest, because we're growing commodity corn. And then, yes, Sarah, so we'll get into it in a second. That's really interesting about the fish. And then what the squash does, they have broad leaves that covers the soil, right? Because we don't want the soil to wash away. It's actually going to reduce evaporation. That's going to be one of the recommendations I give at the end of this, is always cover the soil. So that's one combination. I would, and this is my own personal bent, and I'm going to take the liberty because I'm not at work to go there. I wouldn't say it's the factory style of farming. I would call it capitalism, colonialism that have wiped out these things, right? It's not a recent phenomenon. It's Europeans that came here with their ideas of how the land should be tended to. Bolstered by this idea that we need to be able to measure, understand our yields perfectly so we can market it and make our systems understandable by capitalism. And I would say plantation economics are a great example of that, because that also adds in the factor of free slave labor, which we are still dealing with the ramifications of 400 years later. Right. But what that does is it says, we talked a lot about diversity below the ground. Diversity above the ground, different types of plants growing together, creates diversity below the ground, right? So corn, trees, different types of plants are actually going to attract different types of organisms under the ground, enhancing that diversity. So you're reducing the pests because there's different types of organisms coming together. So like I would love to do a hike with Becky just through one of the woods and just to point out the different plant communities, and we can start seeing like how different things interact.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm gonna pause and go back because you opened up a great like general conversation. Because I also want to talk about the like, what does this mean for modern Shmita? Like, are we getting all of these benefits from the way Shmita is practiced in the world today, specifically Israel? So I'm gonna go back there. So I've broken out different modern halachic approaches to keeping Shmita in Israel. Um, So I've broken the different areas. So one where there's no active farming. I would say this is the closest to what it's when we say don't sow, don't prune, don't till, don't harvest in a certain way. This no active farming area is one. And if you were in Israel this year, it is a Shemitah year, which comes to an end. It started last Rosh Hashanah. It's going to end this Rosh Hashanah. Um, and if you're in the Shuk, people would actually be marketing these different types of produce. So if you're eating Kedusha Shvi'it, the seventh year produce, that means that it's food that was grown this year as, let's say, grapes that grew as a volunteer. You could harvest it in a very specific way. It wasn't intentionally harvested um, in that way. Maybe it was in my backyard. Um, what's the outcome? And similarly, maybe it's food that was grown in the 6th year and I stored it, but this year I'm not growing anything on my land. What's the impact? So I've broken this chart out into 5 areas that I consider the pillars of soil health. One is always having mulch on the ground or cover crop. Cover crop are just low growing living plants like maybe clovers, different types of grasses, because we always want to cover the soil and having plants growing in there because it reduces evaporation and it allows all those organisms to live. It's giving them that food that they need. Low or no till, right? We don't want to blend the soil. Uh, Compost application. So compost, we often think of compost as adding nutrients. That is one part, but almost more importantly, it's adding all those microorganisms that I might have lost from the soil, maybe they weren't there. Same thing, there's this thing called compost tea, where we're actually taking some compost and brewing it in like vats to replicate, multiply all those organisms, and we would spread it out, and again, improving the biological health. And the 5th depends on who you talk to. I think it is actually extremely helpful. Pastured animals. So not animals in a confined feeding operation in Oklahoma where it's a problem, where they have manure lagoons, but animals that are actually living on the land. That activity improves the health of the soil if it's done properly. So if these are happening, we could assume that it's actually improving the soil. So if we're actually not farming, it generally gets a good score, right, in the 7th year. And similarly, because the 6th year has the same outcome, we can imagine it has the same effect. So traditionally, Shemitah will be pretty good. Now, you can't apply compost during Shemitah. You wouldn't probably be able to apply compost tea, but you could do it beforehand. I also add pastured animals being likely because in the traditional context, you're supposed to take down the fences surrounding your field so the needy humans can eat of it. And so animals, wild animals can glean. So it's actually written to the Torah that animals will be a part of the system, which I find extremely cool. And I think it's actually an often overlooked portion. So the other is this idea of legal fictions, which all of us are aware of because we know Passover, right? We sell our chametz. Yes, I know that the bread is really in the cabinet, but I sold it. Rabbi Eric did it on my behalf earlier this year, and it was great. Similarly, a legal solution was, we're going to sell the land to a non-Jew, and they actually own it, so therefore we can farm it. Similarly, the court, a Jewish legal court, a Beit Din can have legal rights to the land, and they're the ones that grow the produce. Therefore, no individual human being is growing the produce. I can farm like normal. These are just legal fictions. Ultimately, nothing changes. So if they weren't taking care of the soil in the first place, that rest isn't happening. Similarly, also, and this area is a little more debatable, but we could import produce from outside of Israel. We could get produce grown by a non-Jew. Or we could get it outside of the borders of biblical Israel, like the south in the Arava, parts of northern Israel. but again, the land isn't resting. Now, we could argue that if I'm getting food from outside of where I normally grow food, then my land is resting. Yes, but it's not clear that one-to-one actually happens in reality. So again, we just get none of these benefits. So the last one I want to look at is hydroponic or high tunnels. So hydroponic systems are soilless systems that pump nutrient-laden water through, and the plant roots rest in them, they grow it. There's no soil. So you can't actually say we're clearly not growing in the ground. So that's actually halakhically allowable. Or we could have plastic tunnels where we grow food in pots. So if it's not actually in the earth, but it's raised above the earth in these pots, it's considered acceptable. And I think this is actually, again, this idea that like, does it displace land that's being grown normally? It's a pretty complex question, which I'm not ready to weigh in on. In general, I'm not a fan of hydroponics, and we could have a whole conversation about that some Shabbos. But it's a gray area. But again, this one-to-one of like, are we actually letting the land rest? Most of the time in Israel today, it's not happening. And I'm not using this to say like, Israel, they're doing a terrible job. But in the modern context, the way we're applying Shmita, we're not getting the benefits that at least a biblical observance of Shmita would give us to the soil. Like science supports that some practice of Shmita will actually improve the soil, improve our ability to grow food long into the future. So if you were really interested in this, and we could maybe share this out in an email or at some point, there's just some of my favorite places to read from. So on the left, Kiss the Ground, which I used a lot of their resources in building this presentation. They have a great video called the Soil Story. The Savory Institute, Regenerative International, they both do a lot of regenerative agriculture work. And there's a lot of work happening in the world of regenerative agriculture, which is soil conscious agriculture. I also did some work, pulled it from the USDA, and they have some great resources. On the right are three of my favorite books. Dirt, The Erosion of Civilizations is a depressing book. It talks about how human civilizations have not gotten farming right for most of our history. And you could kind of correlate the rise and fall of civilizations with how we've treated our soil. He then wrote a follow-up book, kind of like as like a mea culpa, like, oh, but there's hope. It's a great book, but it doesn't give us like the hope. I would say Mycelium Running by Paul Stamets. I'm fascinated by the world of mushrooms. It was like my gateway to the mushroom world. I love it. I might lend it to people if you promise to take really good care of it. And Team with Microbes is a great primer on how to apply this in your own homes. And then the Shmita source book. I am very passionate about it. I'm a co-author on it. It does a lot of great work on talking about Shmita. Just some basic actions, and then we'll leave the rest of the time just to chat. If you have a garden, if any of this interests you, what do I do as a consumer? Buy from regenerative farms if you can. There is such thing as a regenerative organic certification, but it's not that easy to find. Organic doesn't necessarily mean they're taking good care of the soil, so it's not a guarantee. It's likely to be better. If people want to like research the farms that are at the Edgewood Farmers Market and like learn more about them, that would be a fun project. And we could learn more, maybe encourage some kind of a CSA where we, get from a regenerative farmer. Also, just generally supporting environmental justice initiatives. This is initiatives that are really trying to support historically marginalized peoples. At Chazon, we actually, Adama, the farm in northwestern Connecticut, that does amazing Jewish environmental programming, donates a portion of their proceeds to the Northeast Farmer Color of Land Trust. So working in our area to support people of color to get them land, as well as the Black Yield Institute. More practically, and this might be controversial, it might hit some people in like the guts, throw away your rototiller. It does terrible things. I hope I demonstrated that with my blender video. Get off chemicals. It's like giving your soil a drug addiction. If the soil can no longer produce nitrogen naturally, and we're not supporting that natural system, it then becomes dependent on me feeding it nitrogen, and it's really hard to get it off of it. Make and apply compost, mulch, and always have plants growing. And I will chat with anyone about how to do this. It's a lot of fun. And the last, I was just like, get dirty. Like next time you're walking in the park or just walking across your lawn, just take a look and see what is living underneath that area, right? Know that there are billions of organisms that have supported us and all of life throughout most of, all of human history. Um, so I'm going to stop there. And now maybe I love asking people to go into gallery view. And that's the end of the formal presentation. I see Jennifer has a hand up. And I'll also open up the chat to see what I've missed. Oh, I did want to talk about fish. We could talk about that in a second. But Jennifer, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Definitely sets a lot of thoughts percolating. And actually on the chemicals, there's a good historical article about how when chemical companies really started pushing these pesticides in the 1940s and 50s, one of the things they used them for was to tell Southerners, oh, you've got this problem with fire ants, and if you use these chemicals it'll subdue the fire ants. And actually what ended up happening was they created just such a massive swarm of fire ants that they moved across the whole southern, part of the United States. And it actually blew it just created a whole epidemic of fire ants as they kept moving west. But I actually wanted to ask a question about the grazing animals, because you had referred to that. And I had thought that animals with hoofs did do like significant damage to soil. And, I don't know if you read William Cronin's book, Changes in the Land, but looking at what happened when Europeans came to North America in the 17th and 18th century and brought like cattle, and the way in which the cattle and similar animals that they brought with them that just really damaged the soil that Native people had been used to working with, because they did tear it up in really damaging ways with their hoofs. So that was one comment. And the second one is that I saw that there are now recent projects to try to use mycelium, the mushrooms, to like create bricks that you could actually use in architecture, like to build walls. So
You just, okay, I'm going to try to keep all this in my head because you just asked two questions that like get me super, super excited. I wrote a note about the animals damaging soil, so I'll be able to come back to that. The world of fungi is just a fascinating, mind-blowing world. So so I'm moving to Westville on Friday. One of the things I'm excited about is I'm gonna have more space. And one of my dreams is I experimented with growing mushrooms at home. Mushrooms have been shown to do lots of amazing things, including breaking down hydrocarbons, which is oil, petroleum, actually extracting heavy metals and be able to actually bioaccumulate it to facilitate cleanup. The living organism, that structure, has been shown to be extremely strong. The networks they build are structurally strong. So what they do is they will grow it into a form, they being companies that are experimenters, grow into a form, kill and dry it, which will kill it. But then what's remaining is an extremely stable, sturdy building structure. So the world of like mycology and industrial mycology is really a growing field because it's a very hard world to study, and now we have a lot more techniques to study it, and there's more people being interested. Thanks to, I would say, Paul Stamets, who I referenced his book because he opened up a lot of people's minds to it. We have these really cool applications. There's fake meats that people are producing. I mean, it's a huge, huge world. So that's one.
yeah, actually, believe it or not, I saw an incredible exhibit at the Pompidou in Paris about this, but it was all these European teams that were working on it. And I thought, okay, America, as usual, has a lot of catching up to do here.
Yeah, I would say the Pacific Northwest is a hotbed of it. There's some people I know of in upstate New York. I'm sure there's people in Connecticut. Yeah, there's a mushroom grower who I want to connect with, but he's only at the Saturday farmers market, and I haven't been able to get over there. Wait, I want to. Oh, that's very cool. I would love to see that lamp. Um, the animal question, because that's a big one to unpack. So I'm going to preface this with I no longer work in horticulture. So this isn't my day job. So I'm not up to date on it's a complex conversation, and I'm definitely not up to date on it. There's this saying in horticulture, right plant, right place. So there's no such thing as a weed. There's just the wrong plant in the wrong place that's just doing its thing, and it's taking over. And I would extend that to domesticated animals or agricultural animals. Uh, the buffalo, so buffalo could have been said to be, or America could have been said to be one of the largest ranching experiments, in history, because indigenous peoples were quite literally, ranching buffalo across the entirety of the Great Plains. But what they were doing is they weren't fencing off plots. They were naturally allowing buffalo to do the thing and following their lands. They would do prescribed burns, so forest wouldn't crop up, but it would maintain the grazing land. And when there's enough space, what happens is what grazing animals are is they're kind of a machine. Yeah, this is like dehumanizing, but they're a machine in this sense that's taking the plant nutrients, putting it through their animal body, and there's microbes and all kinds of things breaking it down and making it into a very available form of natural fertilizer and compost. Their poop lays that out and adds new bacteria, fertilizing the land, and the action of a herd stampeding through over time will work that into the soil. Now, I say stampeding through because that implies there's a flow in and out. It's not staying in one place. European colonization and capitalism is not good at moving things in and out. We're very good at borders and fencing, right? So when we have a lot of things in one place, it creates a lot of the issues that you're talking about. So the idea like ranching cattle, there definitely was not this scaled ranching of cattle. Contemporary systems, what they'll do is they'll rotate cattle through a large plot of land with electric fencing and not have them stay in one spot. But in general, pasturing animals is a dicey game that there is more and more research on how to do it well. I would say most people aren't doing it well, and but us supporting and paying a little bit extra if we do eat meat to support people that are doing it well goes a huge, long way to actually making change in that arena. Jay, yeah.
I don't know if you have time. I know you don't have time to discuss this, but the halachic issue of mixing crops together, is that agriculturally a problem, or is that just a biblical thing?
That's a good question. This is, it's not an area I'm well versed enough in. It's a thought I've had, Jay, because the best way of growing anything is in this mixed diversity. So I don't know how much things need to be separated, and if it's all crops or is it maybe just grain crops, right? Because like one of the reasons why we're so worried about Kitni Yoram Pesach or certain communities is that plants are mixing and then the grain mixed in with that. So admittedly, it's something we could do research on. I could see it being problematic, and I would say our rabbis of blessed memory were not modern regenerative agriculturists, but many of them were farmers, right, or had a relationship with the land, especially in like the Mishnaic period. So it's an interesting question. I'd love to like dive into it if anyone wants to do that.
Okay, thanks.
Just in the mushroom vein, for a minute, there's a line in the Talmud. I feel like it's in like the second chapter of Shabbat. I'm not sure, but where this one rabbi or this one obnoxious student says there's nothing new under the sun, citing Ecclesiastes. And then the rabbi gives him as a proof. He says no, and the next morning he takes him out and shows him mushrooms, because mushrooms crop up overnight. And the guy who had been saying there's nothing new under the sun was sort of suggesting that like nothing new ever happens, nothing new changes. And it's just a great instance where, like, you just had me thinking about this because it's like kind of funny in context because you're like, yeah, whatever, mushrooms. But you're really being like, no, mushrooms, like this is a really a cool thing. And I don't know, just being able to see sort of like blessing and abundance in mushrooms is pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's something I only got connected to recently. Without our contemporary understanding of it, like mushrooms are really baffling organisms. They just appear and disappear seemingly without reason. Some of them might kill you, some of them might feed you really well. Um, by the way, most of them won't kill you, but I still wouldn't recommend you just grabbing a mushroom. There's, right? They look all kinds of crazy ways. Some of them literally look like pretty phallic, or they actually look like dead people fingers. There's actually a mushroom called dead man's fingers.
Right.
So this idea, like mushroom, I find it interesting. Like the rabbis didn't even know like how to understand them. They were just in like the class of foods. They're just like shehakol. Like they're not plants. They're not animals. We're just gonna call it like they just many things get lumped into there. But like there isn't even like a botanical understanding of what they are. Yeah. So they're really like I think it's such a perfect. That seems like such a perfect example for him to bring in that passage. Probably have time for like one more thought or comment. Yeah, Rachel.
I just want to say thank you for reaffirming something that I had, I think, heard on WNPR or something, that contrary to popular belief that, I should, turn over my garden each year. It was somebody saying very much what you said without all the scientific information, but was just saying, no, you don't need to. And I found it to be such a relief this spring. Sorry, I'm admitting to gardening in Shmita year, but I would kill so many worms and I would just, they were the ones that were visible. And as you're showing with the blender analogy, I was destroying all kinds of other things. But anyway, thank you for reaffirming that I grasped onto because of the worms and because I'm naturally lazy about having to do that much digging. But thank you for affirming that that's really the best thing for the soil.
Yeah, I actually want to. I want to do one more call to action that, as Connecticutites, we actually could have an impact on, which is our lawns. Unfortunately, New Haven has a huge litter problem. They're the plastic yellow pesticide flag things. They shouldn't be anywhere. We have an epidemic of people applying harmful, terrible chemicals to their lawns. And one of the ways we could actually make a difference is talking to our landscapers, ask them to learn about and doing different practices, being okay with a dandelion or two, and clovers should be in the lawn. The only reason why we think they're bad is because Scots told us in the 50s they're bad because their pesticides kill broadleaf plants like that. It's a huge, huge difference we can make. We are blessed to have lots of waterways. Here in East Rock, we actually get the water from the Mill River, and our lawns could leach chemicals and those nitrogen fertilizers into our waterways. It's an area of impact that we can all have that many of us are dealing with. We have direct control over it. So that'll leave it as my final words.
I just want to see if anybody else has anything they'd like to say or ask.
Well, I have a big question. Is that okay?
A big question?
Yeah, well, so we know that this factory food system is a disaster. I mean, we're seeing just the absolute depletion of water in the West, in terms of groundwater, in terms of lakes that are drying up, the Colorado River. But so what are you suggesting should be a food system that will sustain our population, like an actual method of production and distribution?
That is a big question. I don't know if I'm gonna be able to answer all of it, nor am I qualified to, but I will answer an area I feel passionate about is we don't have a food production problem, especially in America. We have a food waste problem. It's estimated 40 to 50% of the food that's grown is not eaten by a human being, but it is thrown away at some point in the system, often in our own homes or in a grocery store that has decided it's not fit to be shown anymore. So we don't really have a food production problem. We have a food distribution problem. And once we take that myth off the table, which I would say it's a myth of big agriculture, because they say, we need to ramp up, and I don't think that's the case. We just need to have better, more reliable practices. It allows us to envision other versions of farming, and there are probably people far more qualified to answer the bigger questions. But what we can do is, I would say, support advocacy around the farm bill when it comes up. And maybe that's something our green team could actually put out some resources on, how we do that as a community. So that second one's a really big question, which we should get some margaritas at Camacho's garage over.
All right. I just want to speak about what's coming up in the future, and then I'm going to say goodbye and thank Bruce in a more effective way. But just so everybody knows, we do have another schmooze next Wednesday night. Rachel, I'm blanking on her name. Singer, music, Edelstein. And she has invited her friend, Matt Austerklein, who is a cantor and has just completed a book, which is about 75 years of cantors in America. So he's going to talk a little bit about that. And I'm sure they're going to talk about music. And I think it'll be very interesting and thought-provoking in a different way than this was. I'd like to say thank you so much, Bruce. This was really informative. Unfortunately, I think it made us all want to know more. So we may have to, I may take you up on your idea of some kind of hike where we, walk and learn, because I think that's a very effective way of really learning about the soil and plants. But thank you so much. And I know you're in the middle of moving, and so I really appreciate your time. And thank you to the folks from Dix Hills for joining us today. It's been nice to see a new face. And I'll see you all soon.
Thank you so much, Bruce. This was awesome. Welcome to Westville.
Thank you. I'll see you all on Shabbos.
And then you need to make house calls, Bruce, to all of our gardens and guide us.
I'd love to.
Also, Nate Bixby is really helpful with people's gardens. He helped us.
Oh, really?
Oh, cool.
Yeah, with West Haven seaweed.
Excellent.
Very cool.
It had washed up. Okay.
All right, Joel, I'm going to get packing.
Good night.
Get packing. See you on
Thank
Shabbos.
you. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.